The first thing they said about Sergeant Teal when she walked into the forward operating base at Kandahar was that someone must have gotten the personnel files mixed up. That was the general assumption. There had to be an explanation, because Sergeant First Class Dara Teal, 31 years old, 5'4", 131 pounds, did not look like someone who belonged in the same room as the men of 3rd Special Forces Group. She looked like someone who had taken a wrong turn on her way to a completely different building, maybe a completely different career. The comment came from Sergeant First Class Novak. He said it quietly, the way men say things when they want others to hear, without being held accountable for having spoken. He said it while she was signing in at the operations desk, her back turned, her kit bag on the floor beside her boots. The comment was about weight. The comment was about height. The comment was about what kind of work a person her size could reasonably be expected to do in a place like this. 3 other men laughed. Teal didn't turn around. She finished signing in, picked up her bag, and asked the clerk which bunk was assigned to her. The clerk told her. She walked to it without looking at Novak or the 3 men who had laughed. Not because she hadn't heard. She had heard every word, but because she had been hearing variations of that comment since her first week at basic training, and she had learned a long time ago that turning around accomplished nothing worth the energy it cost. What accomplished something was performance. She had learned that too. She had been assigned to the FA-B as a scout sniper, attached to a Special Forces operational detachment running reconnaissance and interdiction in Helmand Province. Her primary qualification was long-range precision fire. She held the 3rd highest confirmed engagement score in her battalion, a fact that was noted in her file and not mentioned by anyone at the briefing the following morning. What was mentioned was the terrain. Captain Aldrich ran the briefing. He was a compact, efficient man who spoke the way people speak when they've repeated the same information. Enough times that it no longer requires thought. He pointed to the topographic map on the wall. He said the area of operations was a river valley flanked by 2 ridgelines, elevation roughly 1,800 meters on the eastern side, 1,200 on the western. He said the primary objective was a supply route used by a local network to move materials between 2 known caches. He said the mission was surveillance and assessment only. Clean, in and out within 72 hours. He did not look at Teal when he said clean, but she noticed that he almost did. There were 8 people in the briefing room. 6 of them were men from the detachment. The 7th was a signals intelligence specialist named Petrov, who had been embedded with the unit for 11 weeks and had the particular quietness of someone who had stopped trying to explain his job to people who didn't want to understand it. Teal was the 8th. She sat near the back, not because she was told to, but because the back gave her the best angle on the map. And angles on maps were something she thought about as a matter of habit. After the briefing, Novak caught up with her in the corridor. He wasn't hostile. That was the thing about men like Novak. They were rarely hostile in any way that could be documented. He was friendly. He was collegial. He put his hand on the door frame and leaned in the way people lean when they want to appear relaxed. And he said that she should let one of the other guys handle the eastern ridge if it came to that. The elevation, he said. The pack weight. He said it with the particular kindness of someone who genuinely believed he was doing her a favor. She looked at him. She said, "I'll manage." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've already decided the answer they just received doesn't count. She had grown up in Petawawa, Ontario. Her father had been a sergeant major in the Canadian Forces before he retired, and her earliest memories of him were of a man who treated the physical world as a problem to be solved through preparation. He had taught her to shoot on a .22 when she was 8 years old, not because he wanted her to become a soldier, because he thought precision, the practice of it, the discipline of slowing your breathing and your thinking until they operated at the same frequency, was something worth knowing regardless of what you did with your life. She had joined the U.S. Army at 22 after her family relocated to upstate New York, when her father took a contractor position at Fort Drum. She had applied for the sniper course at 25. She had graduated 4th in her class, not because she was the strongest or the fastest, because she was the most patient, and patience, her father had told her once, is just preparation that hasn't had its moment yet. The moment had a way of arriving. She knew that too. The team moved out before first light on the 3rd day. The insertion was by vehicle to the base of the eastern ridgeline, then on foot. The plan was to establish an observation post on the high ground by 0400 and be in position before the valley floor lit up with the kind of visibility that made movement dangerous. Teal carried 63 pounds. Her primary was an M110 semi-automatic sniper system. She also carried a spotting scope, a rangefinder, a radio, 4 liters of water, rations for 3 days, medical kit, and the particular weight of operating in a unit where several of the men around her were quietly hoping she would prove them right. That weight didn't have a number, but she felt it. They climbed. Novak set the pace at the front of the column. It was a hard pace, harder than it needed to be for the distance and the elevation, and she understood exactly why he had set it that way. She said nothing. She matched it. Her quads burned on the switchbacks above 700 meters, and she breathed through it in the pattern she had used since her first long climb. 4 counts in, hold 2, 4 counts out, and she kept her eyes on the ground in front of her, and she kept moving. Sergeant Drummond, moving behind her, said nothing for the first 2 hours. Around the halfway mark, he said quietly, "You're doing fine." He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it like a fact he was reporting. She appreciated the difference. By 03:05, though, they were at the crest. The valley below them was dark and still. The ridgeline on the western side was a black edge against a sky that had begun, barely, to differentiate itself from the land. Petrov set up the signals equipment behind a rock formation. Teal established her position behind a natural ledge of shale that gave her a 280-degree field of view across the valley floor and the lower slopes of both ridges. She settled in. This was the part of the job that people who had never done it understood least, the settling, the way the body learns the ground beneath it, the way the mind contracts until it contains only what is directly in front of it. She adjusted her bipod. She checked her turret settings. She ran the range to the road markers in the valley. 640 meters to the first, 910 to the second, 1280 to the bend near the dry creek bed. She committed these numbers to memory with the same quiet finality with which she did everything else. Then she waited. For 8 hours, nothing happened. That was not unusual. Surveillance was mostly nothing happening. The discipline of it was in not allowing nothing happening to erode your readiness for when something did. Teal drank water at regular intervals. She stretched her back carefully. She tracked movement in the valley floor. 3 vehicles over the 8 hours, none of them matching the description of what they were looking for, all of them logged. Novak checked on her position twice. The first time, he stood behind her for a long moment without speaking, then left. The second time, he asked if she needed anything. She said, "No." He hesitated. She could feel him wanting to say something else and deciding against it. He left again. Drummond came by around midday and sat against the rock beside her for a few minutes without asking her to talk. She found his presence easier than Novak's. He had been in the unit for 6 years and had developed the particular quietness of someone who had stopped needing to fill silence with performance. At 1340, the radio crackled with an update from the command element. Intelligence suggested movement on the western ridgeline. The detachment commander, Captain Aldrich, redirected 2 of the operators to push forward and investigate. He pulled Novak and a man named Helmand. She had been told his name, but still thought of him only as the one who had laughed loudest off the northern sector and repositioned them 200 meters down the slope. Teal remained at the observation post. She was alone on the eastern ridge, 500 meters above the valley floor, with a 2-kilometer line of sight and a question forming at the back of her mind that she could not quite resolve. The western ridgeline movement, the way the command element had vectored resources toward it, almost immediately. The speed of the redirection. It felt like a pull. She had learned to pay attention to things that felt like pulls. At 1518, she saw the first vehicle come off the dry creek bed road at the southern end of the valley. It wasn't the vehicle from the intelligence briefing. It was a second vehicle, older, canvas-sided, moving without headlights despite the fact that the light in the valley had already begun to flatten toward evening. She reported it. The response from Aldrich was terse, logged. Maintain position. She maintained position. The vehicle stopped 600 meters south of the road junction. 2 figures got out. They moved to the western side of the road and disappeared into the scrub. She tracked them as far as she could through the scope, 180 meters into the scrub before the light and the terrain took them. She reported this too. The response this time was slower. She could hear the quality of the silence on the channel in a way that told her something was happening at the command element that wasn't being communicated to her yet. Then a second vehicle appeared from the northern end of the valley, and a third from the eastern approach road, a track she had been told was impassable. She was very still. This was not a supply route assessment. This was a box. Someone had drawn the lines and she was inside them. And so were 6 of the 8 people she had climbed this mountain with, and the question was no longer about the intelligence picture. The question was about the next 4 minutes. She pressed the transmit button and said, 3 vehicles. Grid references follow. This is an ambush pattern. All elements need to move now. The channel was silent for 3 seconds. Then Aldrich came back. Confirm your grid references. She confirmed them. Another silence. Then the sound from somewhere 200 meters below her on the western slope of small arms fire. It happened quickly after that, the way catastrophic things do. Not gradually, not with warning, but with the sudden quality of a situation that has been developing for a long time and has finally decided to stop pretending it hasn't. Novak's call came over the radio first. His element was pinned. The scrub on the western slope was being used by at least 4 shooters who had been in position before the team arrived, which meant the intelligence on the western movement had been deliberate misdirection. The command element had 3 minutes before the vehicles in the valley floor closed the escape route through the southern track. Kellerman was hit. Not critically. His radio call was composed, almost detached, but he was not mobile. Drummond's voice, somewhere to Teal's right and below. I've got 2 figures moving up the eastern slope. She had already seen them. They were using the loose shale field north of her position as cover. Not good cover, but enough cover. Moving in short rushes the way trained people move when they know the basic doctrine. She estimated the range at 410 meters. The light was degrading. The angle was steep, which meant accounting for a cosine correction on the ballistic. She adjusted. She said nothing on the radio. The first figure moved into the open gap between 2 rock formations and she fired. The second figure stopped. She could see through the scope the particular quality of hesitation that occurs when someone sees something they didn't expect. The hesitation lasted long enough. She fired again. Drummond's voice, clear on the eastern slope. She was already redirected to the valley floor. The second vehicle was now 360 meters from the southern exit track. The primary truck, canvas-sided, had stopped, and a figure was visible in the truck bed with what she identified. At 1,200 meters in degrading light, as a crew-served weapon, she took a breath. She took another one. She thought about what her father had said about patience and preparation, and the moment arriving, she fired. The figure in the truck bed dropped. The truck stopped. On the western slope, the fire from Novak's position changed character, from pinned to advancing, which meant the pressure on his element had shifted. It took her 2 more minutes to understand why. The shooters on the western slope had repositioned, and they had repositioned because the threat calculation on the eastern ridge had changed. She had changed it. The extraction was a controlled withdrawal south through the valley floor while she maintained overwatch from the ridge. Drummond managed Kellerman on the descent. Novak's element broke contact at 1642 and reached the vehicle link-up point at 1711. Aldrich called the exfil at 1720. Teal came off the ridge last. She had been in position for 15 hours and 40 minutes. Her water was gone, and her left shoulder was aching in the particular way. It ached after long periods of sustained position. A deep, grinding complaint from the joint that she had learned to ignore during the shot sequence and deal with afterward. She picked up her kit and moved down the shale field in the last of the light, one careful step at a time. Novak was at the vehicle link-up point when she arrived. He was standing with his arms crossed in the way people stand when they are working through something that is taking longer to process than they expected. He looked at her for a moment. He looked at the ridge she had just come down. He looked back at her. He said, "The crew served 1,200 meters." She said, 1,220. I rounded down. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I wouldn't have taken that shot." She said, "I know." There was a lot more that could have been said. There was the comment he had made while she was signing in. There was the pace he had set on the climb. There was every version of let someone else handle it that he had offered her in the preceding 72 hours. It was all there between them, fully visible to both of them, and neither of them needed to say any of it. He uncrossed his arms. He said, "Good shooting, Sergeant." She said, "Thank you, Sergeant." She walked past him to the vehicle. Kellerman was medevac to Kandahar and released 3 days later with a through-and-through wound to his upper thigh that he would describe, for years afterward, as the least impressive injury he had ever received. He would also describe Teal's shot on the crew served as the most important thing that happened that day. And he would describe it in the specific, matter-of-fact language of someone who knew what it meant in practical terms. Petrov wrote up the signal's intelligence post-action, which confirmed what Teal had suspected from the pattern of the redirection. The movement reported on the western ridgeline had been a planted report, fed through a compromised local contact to the intelligence element, designed to draw the team's attention and resources to the wrong side of the valley at the wrong time. The planning had been careful. It had accounted for almost everything. It had not accounted for the person on the eastern ridge noticing the pull. The post-action briefing was 3 days after extraction. Aldrich ran it. He went through the timeline with the methodical thoroughness of someone who needed to understand exactly what had happened and why, not because he was looking for someone to blame, but because he was the kind of officer who believed that understanding was the only thing that prevented repetition. When he reached 1518, the first vehicle off the dry creek bed road, he paused. He said, "Teal, walk me through what you were seeing at that point." She walked him through it. The vehicle without headlights, the direction of movement, the speed of the command element's redirection toward the western ridgeline. The way these things had composed themselves into a picture that didn't match the intelligence assessment she'd been given. Aldrich listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said, "How long before the first vehicle appeared did you start to think something was wrong?" She thought about it honestly. She said, "About 40 minutes, maybe 50. He nodded. He said, "Why didn't you call it earlier?" She looked at him directly. She said, "Because I'd spent the first 2 days being told not to overthink the picture." The room was very quiet after that. Not the guilty quiet of people caught in something, the particular quiet of people recognizing something true that they would have preferred to continue not recognizing. Aldrich looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his notes. He said, "Going forward, you call it, whatever you're seeing. You don't wait for permission to report an observation," she said. "Understood." She thought about that briefing later, in the particular late-night hours at the FOB, when the operational tempo dropped enough to allow actual thinking. She thought about the 40 minutes, about the calculation she had made, not consciously, not deliberately, but as an ingrained response. When she had decided that her red on the intelligence picture probably wasn't worth raising over the heads of 6 experienced operators who had already made up their minds about what she was there for. She had been right about the ambush. She had also spent 40 minutes being wrong about what her job required of her. These two things were both true simultaneously, and they sat with her in a way that was more complicated than simple vindication. Simple vindication would have been easier, but she had never been particularly interested in easy. 6 weeks later, she was back in Kandahar. Different team, different tasking. A reconnaissance squadron conducting pattern-of-life surveillance on a network that moved components through the river valley southeast of the city. She was the only woman in the compound. The first 3 days were identical in their essential structure to the first 3 days of every previous assignment. The slight pause when she walked into a briefing room, the calibration of responses, the invisible social arithmetic that happens whenever a space established around one set of assumptions encounters something that doesn't match them. She was accustomed to it. What she was less accustomed to, and this was new, and she recognized it as new, was the speed at which the arithmetic resolved. A warrant officer named Brennan, who ran the morning briefings, with the particular directness of someone who had been doing this long enough to have no patience for waste, introduced her to the team in 2 sentences. "This is Sergeant Teal. Some of you may have heard about the action in Helmand 6 weeks ago." She was the overwatch. He said it the way he said everything, not for effect, not to make a point, but because it was relevant information delivered in the appropriate sequence. And she felt something shift in the room that she had not felt before. Not approval. Not the particular warmth of being accepted into a group that had previously excluded you. Something more useful than that. The quiet renegotiation of a set of assumptions. The acknowledgement, impersonal, professional, and entirely sufficient, that the calculation had been run and the result was clear. She was the sniper. That was what she was there for. That was what mattered. She called her father that evening, on the satellite phone. The connection was poor, as it always was from that compound, and they spoke in the clipped shorthand they had developed over years of bad connections and limited time. He asked how she was doing. She said she was fine. He asked about the work. She said it was steady. There was a pause, and in the pause she could hear Petawawa, the particular quality of winter silence in a garrison town, which she had grown up with and which sounded, from a satellite phone in Afghanistan, like something worth getting back to. Her father said, "Anyone giving you a hard time?" She thought about Novak. She thought about the comment in the operations corridor. She thought about the pace on the climb and the minutes she had waited before trusting what she was seeing. She said, "Not anymore." Her father made the sound he made when something was being left unsaid but was understood by both parties. He said, "Good." She said, "Yeah." She told him she'd call again when she could. She hung up and sat for a moment in the silence of the compound, with the satellite phone warm in her hand and the operational area spread out beyond the perimeter wire in the particular darkness of a place with no light pollution, which was, she had always thought, one of the strangest forms of beauty the job had ever shown her. She put the phone away. She went back to work.